Germany had started the Second World War in Europe. That much is very clear. What is usually not so clear, outside of academic circles of history, is that World War I was ignited by someone else, and the declaration made from somewhere else. Those countries who fought as allies with Germany are known to history as the Central Powers. On the other side were countries known as the Axis Powers. Here is how the First World War broke out. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was at that time a part of Austria-Hungary. The following month, on July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war. Although Germany did enter into the conflict on Austria-Hungary's side, it is still important to note that she had not in fact herself started that war. Nevertheless, she got ultimately blamed for it and the entire loss and destruction that followed, and she was most severely punished. Whether this was in fact fair or not, is a matter for debate. Perhaps that was done to Germany from a mix of sheer bitterness and the desire to exact a humiliating vengeance. Germany, it happens, had been the strongest military power in Europe at the time. As a single unit too, it was Germany, apparently, who had inflicted the heaviest blows on the Axis powers. Amongst the Central Powers, Germany had yet again held out the longest during that conflict. First, it had been Bulgaria who surrendered. Then the Ottomans surrendered. Later, it was Austria-Hungary. Finally, then after, came Germany's surrender. As is often said in modern parlance, it appears that the Axis powers may have come to the decision that they wanted to inflict a strategic defeat upon Germany, through the demands and terms they drew up and sought to enforce, from the so-called Treaty of Versailles that formally brought the war to an end. By any account, it was deep humiliation and a nigh absolute stripping. Under the arrangement, Germany was to pay war reparations to Axis powers for all loss from the war, a burden that weighed very heavily on the German economy through the following 2 decades. The German people and economy passed through absolute shock and pain at that time. Curiously, and inadvertently, this horrible state of affairs, engendered by the apparently very harsh conditions set out by the Axis allies for Germany, effectively aided the influence and rise of the extreme nationalist Nazi Party, which eventually came to power in Germany, and brought about an even more vicious war in Europe that has come to be known as the Second World War. At the end of World War I, Germany had been forced to sign what is largely known today as the War Guilt Clause, an acceptance of full responsibility for the war and the entire loss and damage that came in its wake. Germany was forced to cede about 13% of her European territory to France and to Poland, and that part of her called Rhineland came under Allied occupation, who remained there to ensure strict compliance with the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Also, all of her overseas colonies were seized and divided up among the winning Allies. Her army was whittled down to just 100,000 men. The navy was stripped of large vessels and limited to just 6 battleships. There was to be no air force at all. Even her coal-rich Saarland region was lost for 15 years to French administration. It was a complete whitewash. Germany was being made an example of. Germany was being humiliated. Germany was being broken. At least that was the ultimate aim. To permanently weaken Germany. Little wonder then that when the extreme nationalist Nazi Party came knocking, not too many more years after, a very significant proportion of the German population, eagerly, even enthusiastically, opened their doors of welcome. Soon after, there was World War II. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this so far, subscribing really helps the channel grow. Throughout Germany and her surrounding countries occupied, more than 6 million Jews paid the ultimate price. On the German side, an estimated 5.3 million of the military perished while about 1.5 to 3 million civilians lost their lives. American and European Allied death figures from the new conflict generally ran significantly lower, excepting those from the Soviet Union, who suffered the lion's share of both military and civilian losses. It is estimated that at least 24 million of the Soviet population perished during the Second World War. Roughly 9 million were military deaths, with about 15 million civilian. Africa too was not spared. Some of the conflict's most memorable battles were fought in Africa. with notable examples including those fought across the deserts of Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco. Other battles were fought in Ethiopia, to eject the Italians. The war was fought even in Madagascar. Beyond this, droves of able-bodied men from the African populations were drafted into the militaries and sent into battles to fight on the side of their colonial masters. Many were even transported to other lands as reinforcements. What Hitler had initiated in Europe was an evil of industrial proportions. And yet, the Allies too may have helped to fuel and fan the embers that ultimately culminated in the influence and rise to power of that overarching figure of a man, called Hitler. Ultimately, it was not only Europe who paid the price. Virtually the rest of the entire world also did, some to a greater extent than others. It is a lesson the world may have learned through the crucible of massive death and destruction. Yet now it would appear a lesson that, given the passage of time, the world may have gradually become desensitized to, even dismissive of. We need only to look around at events happening right across the world which are shaping our daily realities to feel much more than a little uneasy about the ultimate direction towards which we are headed at this period in history. The United States, it may appear, seeks to bully the rest of the world put together. Sanctions everywhere. Outrageous and hard to really justify tariffs against both friend and foe alike. The US has appeared to threaten Canada towards a coerced incorporation as America's 51st state, appeared to threaten Denmark and other European allies in a bid to force an outright sale of the Danish autonomous territory of Greenland. Over the past year, the US has employed a vicious military attack against Iran, in company of her key regional ally Israel, over military and nuclear disagreements. When the war was suddenly ended, it appeared tensions had been doused. Not for long. America now appears to be preparing for an even more vicious showdown with the Islamic Republic. On the issue of global resources, the US no longer even faintly pretends. Virtually, she seeks monopoly control over all of the world's oil reserves. Already, she appears de facto in control over Kuwaiti oil, the world's 7th largest known reserve. Emirati oil, at number 6. Iraqi oil, at number 5. Saudi oil, at number 2. She has moved against Venezuela, in a daring and very deadly commando operation which resulted in the capture and removal of the country's leader onto foreign land for trial on what most analysts consider to be trumped-up charges. The bottom line, and Trump himself would later virtually confirm, always was control over oil. Venezuela is at number 1, with the world's most abundant proven crude oil reserves. Only 2 of the top 7 oil-rich countries now remain outside of Washington's vice-like control. Those happen to be Canada, at number 4, and Iran, at number 3. The United States and Israel have already attacked Iran on the pretext of attempting to acquire a nuclear weapon. Yet, more credible may be Washington's and Israel's obsession over weakening Iran to the point it can be easily overrun. Why? The suspicion almost always comes back down to the same age-old matter of resource control. America desires absolute and unrestrained control over sovereign Iranian oil. Quite of late, Washington has begun again barking out the threats and preparations for war around Iran. There have been quite widespread nationwide protests across Iran since at the end of December 2025, over deeply worsening economic conditions. Trump has directly alluded to those and openly egged the protesters on, even though there have been quite credible indications that a significant portion of the protests had turned grossly violent, and people were viciously attacking critical public institutions and rampantly killing members of the country's security forces. America is just one country among many in the world. Were Trump perchance to achieve decisive control over the most significant portion of the entire world's resources, as it now seems he is actively seeking, what might the result be? What then happens with the other 194 nations? What happens to China, who represent the 2nd largest economy in the world, with much need for those same resources, at sustenance and development as well? Might they, then, be condemned to proceed on their knees, figuratively or even literally, before the great Trumpshington D.C., to beg for crumbs of the oil in order to just survive? What happens to much of the other countries of the world, who may not be so naturally endowed with crude oil or other major mineral resources? What happens to Canada? Might they simply be blackmailed into absorption as America's 51st state, just to survive any oil or trade crunch, or worse? All of these events and realities are matters which raise the serious concern and question whether at all the world ever learned any lessons from the disturbing series of events that led to the First World War, and then later, the Second World War, because these events, seeming merely as political playabout now, taken one at a time, threaten in hindsight to constitute the series of remote or even immediate events that eventually resulted in the Third World War. If you enjoy thinking critically about history, not just memorizing dates, subscribe and join the conversation.